Previously on Trail Recon, I had the opportunity to have access to 6 bone stock Jeep Wranglers, 6 different lift kits. Then we got them all installed and I shared some lift height measurement results with you all. In this part 2 video, we'll take these 6 Jeep Wranglers out on the road and see how they drive, and then we'll take them off-road and put them through their paces. And finally, I'll choose a winner. Stay tuned. Welcome to Trail Recon. I'm Brad, and today on this series of the ultimate Jeep Wrangler lift kit comparison, we're going to be talking about how well the lift kits performed both on-road and off-road, and I'm going to choose my winners in several different categories. But before we jump into that, I just want to share something on a personal level. You know, going into this comparison, I was a little concerned. I was like, man, am I going to really be able to tell the difference from one kit to the next? And the answer to that is absolutely. You know, when you have 6 identical Jeeps with the same tires and you hop in from one to the next, to the next, to the next, you can definitely tell there is a difference. You know, when I drive my buddy's Jeep and then a couple weeks later I'll drive somebody else's Jeep, it's tough to tell side by side. You know, their Jeeps are outfitted with different bumpers and different gear and different tires, and yeah, they all drive great. But when you do it side by side like I was able to do in this comparison, wow, this has really changed my perspective on lift kits. Now, before we go and start looking at how well they performed on-road and off-road, let's do a quick recap of the 6 lift kits used in this comparison. So the 6 lift kits being used in this comparison are the Krawler 3.5-inch X-Factor No Limits mid-arm system, the American Expedition Vehicles 2.5-inch Dualsport RT suspension, Icon Vehicle Dynamics 2.5-inch Stage 1 suspension lift kit, JOCK's Pro Edition 4-inch suspension lift kit with Fox shocks, the DYNATRAC Endurosport 2-inch suspension lift kit, and Teraflex's 3.5-inch Sport ST3 suspension system with Falcon SP2 3.3 shocks. And if you'd like more specifics on each of these lift kits and to see how well they measured out against one another, be sure to go back and watch the original video. I will leave a link down in the description below. Okay, now let's get these things out on the road. Now for my thoughts on the on-road and off-road performance of all of these suspensions. Now, keep in mind, this is my subjective opinion, but I was really surprised by how different all of these were. And I'll just start by doing this alphabetically. Driving the AEV Dualsport RT suspension Jeep on the road was a great experience. The ride was slightly firmer than the others in this test, but not harsh, and I felt the Jeep handled better around corners and at high speeds than the others in this comparison, and I actually preferred it over the stock suspension. The steering still maintained a good solid feel, and I really just enjoyed driving it on the road. Off-road, however, the firmness of the suspension was noticeable. It handled well on the smooth sections of trail, but with just the slightest increase of speed over rocky terrain and the long washboard roads, I wanted for a little less stiffness. There were sections of the trail that I had to slow down way more than the other Jeeps due to the firm ride. But I think this goes back to how AEV designs this kit. If this Jeep had been outfitted with steel bumpers, a winch, and expedition gear, it may have felt a little smoother. But I suppose adding a little weight to all the Jeeps in this comparison would have had a similar effect. On the rocks, going slow, the AEV handled well. The suspension articulation was just enough to making choosing your line on the rocks easily done with confidence. Overall, the AEV Jeep was excellent on-road, and overall off-road performance was good. Next up is the DYNATRAC Endurosport suspension, and out of all the suspensions I tested, this one felt the closest to stock on the road. I honestly believe that if I had done a blind test and was placed in the stock Jeep and then this Jeep outfitted with the DYNATRAC suspension, I don't think I could tell a difference. Driving this Jeep at highway speeds, on some bumpy back country roads, and cornering never made me feel like I was in anything other than a stock Jeep. I really suppose it comes down to what someone wants from a suspension on-road. Do you want it to feel firmer and more stable than stock? Do you want it softer than stock? Or do you want it to feel like it did before you put that lift kit on? If you want the latter, then know that the DYNATRAC spring rates and shock tuning nailed it. But what about off-road? Well, I was admittedly surprised at how well this DYNATRAC suspension did. Getting up to speed on some washboard sections of trail, crossing over bumpy and rocky sections was effortless. I found myself getting on the gas a little bit more than some of the others because the suspension did such a great job of absorbing the bumps and keeping the Jeep settled. If I was going to be spending a lot of time on some long treks through some rough terrain, this suspension would be one of my top choices. Now, over the rocks, the DYNATRAC suspension felt good, but because it was the lowest in this comparison, choosing your tire placement did take a little more consideration than some of the others. There were a couple times when we just kissed the frame on the rock. All in all, I give the DYNATRAC Endurosport suspension high marks for on-road handling, and I would totally be comfortable driving it on long off-road adventures. Now stepping into the Jeep outfitted with the Icon Vehicle Dynamics Stage 1 kit, which if you recall is a 2.5-inch kit that measured the second tallest out of this entire comparison. On-road, the comfort of the ride was slightly firmer than stock, but not stiff, and cruising down the back roads was a pleasure. My only critique here is when I was at highway speeds and I hit a bump, the Jeep just felt a little more unsettled than the other Jeeps in this comparison. It wasn't dramatic, but slightly noticeable. I think because this lift is so high, it may benefit from some geometry correction brackets or the adjustable control arms that are offered in their Stage 2 kit to help correct that caster. Off-road, this suspension felt good. The shocks did a great job of absorbing the bumps on the washboard trail sections, and while it was a little firm over the rough, rocky obstacles, the increased ground clearance and suspension articulation made it effortless to crawl over the rocks. As I mentioned in the first video, this is their most basic suspension package, but I think I would opt for their Stage 2 or Stage 3 system, which offers a better geometry correction right out of the box. If you're looking for a firmer on-road ride with some great ground clearance to get you through those challenging obstacles at a low price point, the Icon Stage 1 kit is a good option. Next up is the JOCK Pro Edition 4-inch suspension lift. And getting this setup out on the road, you quickly notice a difference with the anti-rock sway bars. The ride is softer and there is just a slight bit more body roll than normal. It's not excessive, but when I climbed in from one Jeep to the next, I could definitely tell a difference. The ride down the backcountry roads was comfortable, but I would prefer a little tighter setup for long highway trips. Off-roads at slow speeds, over rough terrain, and navigating large rocks is effortless for this suspension. With the most ground clearance in this comparison, choosing your line over the rocks is done with ease. At high speeds on the trail and over washboard roads, I found myself letting off the accelerator just a little bit more than I would have on some of the other Jeeps. Just wish there would have been a little more stability through some of those sections. At the end of the day, this kit is a comfortable on-road ride and ready to make easy work of hardcore trails. I think this kit is perfect for someone using their Jeep primarily seeking out those most challenging trails. Now for the Krawler X Factor No Limit system. This kit really surprised me on the pavement. I expected this setup, because it is so tall, to be a little soft on the road. It was not the case at all. I was pleasantly surprised by how well it handled both at low and high speeds on the road. The steering felt great and not heavy like you would expect from a taller lift system like this. The suspension felt balanced around turns, and I'd be perfectly happy taking this Jeep on a long road trip to go seek out some of those faraway hidden trails. Off-road on the trail at high speeds, the suspension was tight, but a little on the firm side, and in some sections that I went through a little faster in other Jeeps, I had to slow down just a little bit with this one. But put this Jeep on some big obstacles and off you go.
The suspension articulation out of all in this comparison made easy work out of everything I threw at it during this entire test. All in all, the Krawler setup has extremely well-behaved road manners and hardcore rock-crushing capabilities. Last up is the Teraflex Sport ST3 suspension system, which is the only suspension that came with adjustable shocks in this review. Now, we set the shocks to their softest setting and left them there for the remainder of this comparison. On-road, the Teraflex Jeep was a pleasure to drive, comfortable on the back roads and on the freeway, just slightly softer than the stock suspension, but still handled extremely well. Off-road, well, that suspension is dialed in perfectly, hitting the washboards at high speeds, rolling over rough terrain, and getting after it on some of the wide open sections was effortless. The Jeep felt so settled at speed and on the trail that I never felt out of control. On the rocks, this kit performed great. While this suspension lift didn't have the highest clearance or the most articulation in the group, it didn't feel like it was missing anything. Crawling up and down the rocks was a breeze. Now, I mentioned we set the shocks at their softest setting and left them there for the entire test. That's because I never felt the need to firm up the ride. Adding some steel bumpers, a winch, some gear in the back, then perhaps making some adjustments might be in order, but it wasn't needed for this test. The Teraflex Sport ST3 setup paired with these Falcon shocks is a true pleasure to drive on and off-road. I have had a blast over the last 2.5 days driving all these vehicles on road and off road. We've had so much fun out here in Moab, and a big thanks to Dixie 4-Wheel Drive for letting us use their shop and coming out here and helping us test these vehicles. Now I have a lot of data that I need to compress and put together, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to head home, put all that together, and then give you guys the results. So I will see you back in the Trail Recon Garage.
Welcome back to the Trail Recon Garage. Now let's dive into the winners of this. But before we do that, I want to do two things. One, let's address the elephant in the room, and that is my eyes. I know they're a little glossy and red, and somebody's going to say some knucklehead thing in the comments below. But look, I was down and out pretty hard last week. I'm feeling much, much better, but my eyes still just look like, you know, like I've been crying or whatever. The second thing that I want to talk about before we get to the winners is there were a lot of comments in the original video about why wasn't this manufacturer or that manufacturer in the comparison, and it wasn't because I didn't want to have them in this comparison. Really, we reached out to several other companies, but because of production delays or they just respectfully declined to participate, they weren't included. So I still think we have a pretty good representation of some good quality manufacturers that a lot of people consider to be some good lift kits for their Jeep. Now, the other thing I want to talk about, and this one is kind of important. I think a lot of people think that when they spend, $2,000 or $3,000, they spend a lot of money on their lift kit, and they go from, a stock Jeep or maybe a lift kit that they weren't happy to, and they install this, and then now their Jeep performs so much better, they instantly think that that's the best lift kit out there. But the truth of the matter is, yes, maybe your suspension went from X to Y, and now it's much better. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the best. I mean, maybe if you would have installed another one on there, you could have been able to do a comparison. So just keep that mindset in there. Yes, all these lift kits are great. There are a lot of other manufacturers out there that are great. But just because it's better than what you had before doesn't mean it's the best, okay? I've fallen into that trap of way of thinking before. The last thing I want to mention is this was a short-term comparison. I only had these lift kits for a week, so there's no way to tell how well these are going to perform long-term. And there's some things on these lift kits that you want to really take a look at is how many OEM parts is it using? Because if you're swapping out control arms and you're using different joints, those joints may need to be serviced in the future. And so depending on where you live in the country or in the world, if you're in a muddy place or a place that snows and gets salty, you may have to service those joints more often than you would a stock one. So that's just something that you need to consider if you're going to choose one of these lift kits. Take a good look at those parts, take a good look at the warranties. I think that's very important. All right, enough rambling. You guys just want to know who won, right? Okay. So we broke it down into categories, and the first category was ease of installation. And so I think this one was pretty easy to figure out. The runner-up in this was AEV. AEV had great instructions, and that install went very quickly. And I love the fact that there was no drilling, no cutting. Everything just laid right into place. It was a great system. But the winners in this category were DYNATRAC and Icon. And I'll say that I couldn't really pick one over the other because they were basically just swapping in some shocks and some springs and some sway bar end links, and super easy to do. I think anybody, bring a buddy over to your garage on a Saturday morning, and by Saturday afternoon you're out on the trail with one of those lift kits. So those are the winners on ease of install. Now, let's talk about the best on-road. Because, man, this one was tough. There are definitely some differences, but I spent a lot of time driving each vehicle over and over and over again on the road to really get a feel for how well they performed. And the runner-up in this category was the DYNATRAC one. The DYNATRAC just felt so close to stock. It just felt great on the road. I loved how it drove, and I meant it when I said it in earlier. I don't know if I could tell a difference if I was blindfolded going from a stock Jeep to that one. And so I think that's what most people look for, is they want stock or a little bit better than stock. And so that brings us to the winner. I think the best on-road suspension in this comparison was AEV. AEV just felt great on the road, especially if you were braking, turning hard. It just felt very comfortable on road, and so there's the winner for best on road. Now, best off road. So I'm changing the rules here because they're kind of my rules anyway. Originally, I was just going to give you second and first place on off-road capability, but after doing this comparison, I realized I really need to segregate this a little bit. Let's talk about hardcore rock crawling, and then let's talk about the general mild to moderate trail use, because I think those are two different types of suspension needs, right? If all you do is hit it hard every weekend after every weekend, your suspension needs are going to be different. If you're like most people, maybe you're hitting, it's the nice easy trails, you're going exploring, you're going and looking for, some cool scenic spots, and you're hitting some mild obstacles along the way. I think that's most people are in that category. So let's talk about hardcore trails. JOCK did it well. I was really impressed with the JOCK. I mean, look, it's tall. I mean, we're 4-inch lift kit, and those anti-sway bar made it just really nice off-road. But I think hands down, without question, the winner in the rock crawling area is definitely the Krawler suspension. I mean, that suspension articulates like nobody's business, and I think if we would have had a different offset wheel, we would have had a little less rubbing, and we probably could have got even a little bit more, but that thing just felt right on the rocks. I mean, it wasn't bouncy, just felt solid going through everything, spot on. So if you're looking for a hardcore, getting after it suspension, Krawler I think is the way to go. Now, what about if you're on those easy to moderate trails, you're going in, washboard roads, you're going to spend a long time on a long expedition off-road, you're going to go get after it a little bit mildly. Second place was very surprising to me, but what I really think, I want to mention this because this is very important. So all the guys from Dixie 4-Wheel Drive that were helping me drive all these vehicles out there so I could test them, I was getting their feedback. And in this specific area, I asked for their feedback on their top two. Every single one of the drivers, every single one, they picked these 1 and 2 or 2 and 1. They were their top two. So this is, it was nice. My opinion is also shared with everybody else that was driving them. So number 2 in the off-road performance category is the DYNATRAC suspension. Absolutely, that thing was great. The DYNATRAC suspension just soaked up the bumps on those washboard roads. It felt great going around corners, no worries. That is a great off-road suspension. That one surprised me. The number 1, though, if I just have one suspension off-road, it would have been the Teraflex. The Teraflex was amazing. I mean, the valving on those shocks was perfect. And again, we never changed the setting on those adjustable shocks. We left it at soft the whole time. That thing just soaked it up. It was a pleasure to drive. I didn't mind hitting it hard on those washboard roads, on the rocks, just going fast. It just felt comfortable. I could spend all day in that Jeep, in that suspension, no worries. So hands down, Teraflex, that was the winner in that category. Okay, now what about best value? I needed to really think about this one quite a bit because I didn't want best value to necessarily be, as the cheapest suspension. And the runner-up in this category, AEV, is a great value suspension for what you get, for the capabilities it has, for the quality of the stuff, and the ease of installation. I think it's a great suspension system. Now, the winner in this category also happens to be the least expensive in this category, but that is because it performed so well. I could see, spending, just a little bit of money on suspension kit, but getting out there and just didn't perform well. Well, that was not the case with DYNATRAC. The DYNATRAC suspension is the best value you can get. If you are on a budget and you need a good suspension and you want to run 37-inch tires, DYNATRAC's the way to go. Okay, now, are you ready to hear my winner? Well, before we talk about the best overall suspension, I just want to mention this one last thing that I think is very important. I used 2020 Jeep Wranglers with a 3.6 liter engine for this comparison. We didn't use a diesel, we didn't use the 2.0, and if you were to take these suspensions, put them on an older model, Jeep Wrangler, or maybe you want to put it on a truck or a Toyota 4Runner or whatever, doesn't necessarily mean how well they did in this comparison is going to translate to a different vehicle. So just keep that in mind, that this is for the 2020 Jeep Wrangler 3.6. And my winner for this overall comparison is the Teraflex suspension. And this was actually a very easy decision. I love that suspension. The quality of the suspension, and oh, by the way, their instructions were spot on, but the quality of their components were amazing. And I really tried not to factor in the fact that this came with adjustable shocks because nobody else's did. But that is a very nice thing to have, because if you start modifying that Jeep to have that adjustability, is really going to pay huge dividends down the road. On-road, it drove great. I loved how it handled. And off-road, boy, I tell you, I say it again and again, I could drive that Jeep all day long. 3.5 inches of clearance. When you're hitting it hard, it was easy to do, no worries. But on those long washboard roads, man, it just soaked it all up. So that's my winner for the 2020 Jeep Wrangler Ultimate Suspension Comparison. This has been a ton of fun to do and really enlightening on a personal level. I hope you have enjoyed following me along on this comparison. I hope you've learned a little bit and gained some knowledge about these suspensions. Hopefully this will help you decide on maybe what is the best suspension for your vehicle. Depending on how you use it, one of these kits might just be right for you. Well, big thanks to the guys over at Dixie 4-Wheel Drive for letting us invade their shop and helping out the entire week. Those guys are great. And a big thanks to all the companies that allowed us to review their suspension. I really appreciate that. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.